Donc, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Hello, everyone. My name is Alida Asmel, and I am the Partnerships and Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator at CRIR. Je suis la coordinatrice au partenariat et à la mobilisation des connaissances au CRIR. C'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour la série Apprendre à se connaître. Today, we are going to have a bilingual presentation. Thank you for joining us for the Getting to Know Each Other CRIR series. Avant de commencer, je voulais reconnaître que nous sommes sur les terres non cédées du territoire traditionnel des Kanien'kehá:ka, les Mohawks. Tiohtià:ke, Montréal, est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour de diverses nations et nous apprécions profondément les liens historiques et continus que les Autochtones ont avec ces terres et ces eaux. Donc, but before starting today, I would like to just begin by acknowledging that we are gathering today, even though online. Me personally, from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, the unceded indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. And they are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters, so of which I am residing on. So with this being an online conference, of course, maybe not everyone is coming from Montreal, so I do invite you to acknowledge and share with us in the chat the various places and nations that are maybe closer to you, and if you don't know what they are, to look that up. Before I pass on the mic to Walter Wittich, who will be moderating the session today, just a little reminder for some Zoom etiquette. During the conference, I do invite you to keep your microphone off and to identify yourselves in the chat if you have a question or a comment. And after the presentations, we will have an oral question and answer, so you can also keep your question to present out loud after the 3 presentations we have today. As you may have noticed already, this is a recorded presentation. La présentation est enregistrée aujourd'hui et sera mise sur le site web du CRIR. So the conference is being recorded and will be placed on the CRIR website after today. Without further ado, I present you Walter Wittich, who will take it from here.
Bonjour la gang. Hello everybody and welcome to our CRIR session today. Dans le but de se connaître, un truc de savoir sur le labo Walter, c'est un vie bilingue chez nous. We go back and forth between the languages all day long. En fin de la journée, personne ne sait quelle langue on a parlé toute la journée. So this will be confusing to some, and it's intended to be that way. We will go back and forth between the languages today. Je vous encourage de poser vos questions dans n'importe quelle langue. I will follow the chat while the members of my lab are presenting today. And so le but d'aujourd'hui, c'est d'introduire un peu de qu'est-ce qui se passe chez nous, qu'est-ce qu'on fait au niveau de recherche en réadaptation déficience sensorielle. We'll start out with our presentation by Natalie Martiniello, who is a certified vision rehabilitation therapist and who very recently completed her PhD in vision science at UDM, the School of Optometry. Now, Dr. Martiniello, and congratulations again. Natalie, we hand over control to the screen to you. Et je te laisse parler de qu'est-ce qui se passe dans le monde de recherche en braille.
Perfect. So I'll just get my slides. Okay. So thank you, Walter. So as mentioned, my name is Natalie Martiniello, and today the title of my talk is Exploring Predictors of Braille Reading Performance Among Working Age and Older Adults with Visual Impairments, which I completed just recently under the supervision of Walter Wittich. So it's estimated that there are 253 million people worldwide with a visual impairment, and this number is expected to double in Canada and triple worldwide over the next 3 decades. This is due both to population growth and aging. So unlike the past, The most common visual conditions today are all those encountered, acquired later on in life. Similarly, as individuals age, we see an increased prevalence of dual sensory or combined vision and hearing impairment. For many of these clients, they may be unable to rely on print for some or all of their tasks. And for this reason, reading-related difficulties are the most common reason for referral to vision rehabilitation today. Now, some of these clients may benefit from Braille. The Braille code is a tactile system of reading and writing used by persons who are blind. Before Braille, it's important to know that the blind could neither read nor write, and were not formally educated, so they relied entirely on charity. Today, Braille is correlated with higher levels of education, employment, and income for people who are functionally blind. So it consists of 6 dots positioned in a 3x2 matrix, as you see on the slide. Different combinations of these dots form the shapes needed to create all the letters and numbers and punctuation that you need to write over 133 languages today. So, although Braille is traditionally read on hard copy paper, refreshable Braille devices like the one shown here on the slide can be attached to smartphones and computers to provide greater access to information, and they also incorporate dots of greater height that may be of benefit to those older adults with reduced tactile sensitivity. Within adult Braille rehabilitation, there are 3 categories of clients that we encounter. So those with congenital visual impairments who learned Braille early on and who may require new services. A small segment of those with congenital visual impairments who did not learn Braille previously and who may require it now. And a growing majority of those with age-related conditions who were previously sighted and who are prospective Braille clients. All 3 of these categories will experience age-related declines as part of the learning process. So unlike visual print, where several letters are perceived simultaneously, Braille is read sequentially as the hands move across the Braille page. This places a greater demand on working memory for newer learners and for those with reduced tactile perception where reading is slower. Typical aging is associated with declines in tactile, motor, and cognitive capacities, but little is known about what influence this may have on Braille reading ability. To further illustrate the need for research on Braille and aging, I previously conducted a scoping review on the factors related to Braille reading performance. Although no restriction was placed on date of publication, only 36 articles were identified, and most of those focused on younger participants. So the goal of this study was therefore to explore the physiological and cognitive factors which correlate with Braille reading performance among working age and older adults. The study was guided by 3 main questions. First, what is the correlation between age and tactile, motor, and cognitive capacities among adult Braille readers? Second, what are the correlates of Braille reading performance within this sample? And then finally, what is the influence of reading mode, reading silently or aloud, as well as reading format, reading on paper versus on a Braille device? So in addition to providing demographic information, for working memory, a tactile adaptation of the visual pattern test was used. For fine motor dexterity, the Purdue pegboard test was used to obtain measures of fine motor dexterity on both hands separately and both hands when used together. And for tactile perception, 2 measures of passive acuity and 2 measures of active acuity were administered. For reading speed, 4 passages from the International Reading Speed Test were used, so on paper, on a Braille device, read silently, and read aloud. In total, 46 participants were recruited, placing this study within the top 15% of the sample sizes from the scoping review I mentioned earlier. Participants range between the ages of 23 and 88 with a mean of 52. Braille learning age ranged between 4 and 63 with a mean of 12. So most participants learned Braille before the age of 12. 78 of the participants use Braille at least weekly, if not more. So we explored the correlation between the age of participants and the measured capacities to better understand how age might influence performance on those underlying capacities that are important for Braille reading. So consistent with previous research, increased age was associated with decreased performance on all tactile, motor, and cognitive capacities. However, this was especially true for the 4 tactile sensitivity measures, which decreased most significantly with increasing age, as you can see on the slide. So we next computed the correlation between all variables and reading speed, and we placed those with the highest correlation into a multiple regression to predict Braille reading speed. The factors most significantly related to Braille reading performance were Braille learning age, active tactile sensitivity, and the frequency of Braille usage, so how often you use Braille. The model predicted that for every year older that a person was when they first learned Braille, reading speed decreased by 6.7 characters per minute. That would mean that someone who learned Braille at the age of 40 would be reading 45 words per minute slower than someone who learned at the age of 5. Increased frequency of Braille usage was associated with a mean increase in reading speed of 31 characters per minute. And then finally, every 1/10 of a millimeter increase in tactile sensitivity, which means poor tactile acuity, was associated with a decrease in reading speed of about 18 characters per minute. So consistent with previous research, silent reading was significantly faster than reading aloud, though no difference based on reading format was observed. However, the participants in our study all had very good tactile sensitivity. And we did find in a follow-up study that the Braille device was particularly more beneficial for older adults with reduced tactile sensitivity. So this study highlighted that age alone does not appear to affect Braille reading speed. Instead, learning earlier, having better tactile acuity, and using Braille more often were significant correlates of Braille reading performance. This is really noteworthy given that these factors were highlighted as barriers by participants in a previous study that we conducted, who spoke of delays to the start of training and few opportunities to practice Braille and to develop those tactile skills. So although electronic Braille devices may facilitate learning for those with reduced tactile sensitivity, we also know from our previous research that these devices are often out of reach for adults with vision loss, due both to cost and very restrictive eligibility criteria. So several implications for policy and practice can be drawn from these findings. We previously found that there is a potential stigma towards Braille and aging among some clinicians. So professionals should remain aware of the often very unconscious biases about Braille and the abilities for older adults to learn new skills, which may delay the start of Braille training, especially given the importance of introducing Braille as early on as possible. Participants also require frequent opportunities to practice Braille between sessions, which is noteworthy given that Braille training often occurs once a week, if not less, at the adulthood level. And then finally, we need to kind of review and revise the eligibility criteria for Braille devices to take into account the needs of older adults who are often neither working nor studying. And so with that, I would like to thank everyone who supported my research. On the slide here, you'll see that I've included the words thank you in Braille. And later on, I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Natalie. Laisse-moi expliquer que notre équipe a décidé de faire les 3 présentations au début, and then we will have a question period for everybody at the very end after the 3rd presentation. So, je vous encourage de continuer avec les questions parce que j'ai déjà vu, on a quelques questions dans le chat. Meanwhile, we will head on straight into presentation number 2. Je vous donne Maxime Blot. Maxime is a orientation and mobility specialist with his master's in vision science. Il est présentement dans une situation un peu partagée parce qu'il est dans le labo de Maurice Tito pour suivre ses études pour le doctorat en sciences de vision. Sauf qu'il a aussi passé un peu de temps dans le labo l'année passée. On a fait notre expérience COVID 2020. Pendant, on a travaillé dans un projet de l'imprimante 3D. And so today's presentation is about his 3D printing work. Maxime, tu as contrôle du écran.
Merci, Dr. Wittich. Donc, voilà. Donc, moi, je vais faire la présentation en français. Par contre, mes diapositives vont être en anglais afin de rester bilingue. Donc, je vais vous présenter, en fond, la recherche que j'ai faite cet automne dans le laboratoire du Dr. Wittich. Bref, c'est une revue de la portée de la littérature concernant l'utilisation de l'impression 3D comme outil de réhabilitation pour assister les personnes en surdicécité. Aujourd'hui, on va vraiment plus faire un survol des résultats qu'on a trouvés, vraiment plus pour susciter la réflexion, la discussion, puis même encourager, si possible, la recherche dans ce domaine-là. Donc, premièrement, pourquoi la surdicité? La surdicité, c'est une condition qui est la combinaison vraiment d'une déficience visuelle avec une déficience auditive et qui va arriver, dans le fond, au sein de la même personne, du même individu. Bien qu'on n'en entend pas beaucoup parler, c'est une condition qui va affecter 0,2 à 2 de la population mondiale. C'est une condition qui est très limitante. Bref, pourquoi? Parce que ça va mener à une difficulté, même l'impossibilité de pallier, de compenser à la perte visuelle à cause de la perte auditive, donc d'utiliser l'audition ou même vice-versa. Ça va avoir un effet quand même assez grand sur beaucoup de sphères de la vie, surtout au niveau de l'apprentissage, l'accès de l'information, la communication, la mobilité, les soins, les soins personnels, la vie domestique et même au niveau des interactions, des relations interpersonnelles, justement avec les problèmes de communication que ça va engendrer. Donc, surtout le défi avec la surdicité, c'est que c'est une condition qui est très variable. Ça va arriver avec plusieurs niveaux de gravité possibles, différents temps d'acquisition de la condition. La surdicité peut être soit congénitale, acquise, et comme Nathalie le dit si bien, on sait que cette population-là, elle est dite d'augmenter dans les prochaines années, surtout avec l'augmentation des personnes âgées qui vont acquérir une surdicité à cause de conditions liées à l'âge. Et donc, au final, la population en surdicité va être une population qui est très hétérogène, qui va être sous-diagnostiquée, sous-estimée et donc moins bien comprise par la population en général et même va être considérée comme une population limitée qui va être moins intéressante, moins profitable pour les compagnies, même certains chercheurs. Donc, ça va mener à moins de recherche, moins de développement pour des nouveaux produits, des nouvelles technologies pour ces gens-là. Et donc, on se retrouve avec un besoin, un manque constant de nouvelles technologies d'assistance. Et qu'on sait, ces technologies-là vont avoir vraiment un rôle là, définitif, un rôle très, très positif et important dans la réhabilitation de ces gens-là. Et donc, nous, on s'est dit, s'il y a un manque dans les nouvelles technologies, est-ce qu'il n'y aurait pas des technologies qui sont déjà accessibles, déjà utilisées par la population en général, qu'on pourrait utiliser, même adapter pour la réhabilitation des personnes en surdicicité? À l'intérieur de ces technologie-là, eh bien, il y aurait l'impression 3D qui pourrait avoir un grand potentiel pour la réhabilitation. Pourquoi? Parce que c'est vraiment un moyen automatique de produire des objets en 3 dimensions qui sont tangibles à l'aide du design digital. Bref, l'impression 3D va permettre de prendre un certain modèle 3D sur l'ordinateur, par exemple en ligne, de le transformer en code qui va être lu par une imprimante 3D qui va par la suite utiliser un certain matériau, par exemple un plastique, qui va faire fondre dans une buse et va le déposer couche par couche, couche par-dessus couche par-dessus couche, afin que l'objet soit au final complété et utilisé par une personne physiquement. Pourquoi un grand potentiel aussi? C'est parce que c'est une technologie qui va être de plus en plus abordable, facile à utiliser et accessible. Et surtout, c'est une technologie qui a un grand potentiel pour la personnalisation, justement, avec le design digital. En ce moment, on sait que ça va être un outil de plus en plus utilisé par les professeurs pour créer du matériel éducatif. Et il y a aussi beaucoup de littérature qui va commencer à apparaître sur son utilisation pour les personnes en déficience visuelle, surtout pour la création, en fond, de modèles 3D qui vont être efficaces pour la manipulation tactile. Par exemple, pour rendre accessibles des livres illustrés pour les enfants, créer du matériel pour apprendre le braille, faire des cartes tactiles et même rendre accessible l'art et l'architecture de certains bâtiments. Et donc, on s'est dit, ça pourrait être aussi utile pour les personnes en surdicité, où est-ce que le sens du toucher va devenir encore plus important. Ça va être le moyen principal d'obtenir de l'information, justement, avec les difficultés au niveau de la communication, de la réception des descriptions verbales. Mais par contre, on ne peut pas prendre pour acquis qu'ils vont l'utiliser de la même façon que les personnes en déficience visuelle, justement avec ces problèmes de communication-là qui s'ajoutent. Ils vont peut-être utiliser le matériel de façon différente, communiquer de façon différente. Donc, notre question de recherche, au final, ben, c'est d'établir vraiment le statut de la littérature, qu'est-ce qu'on sait sur l'utilisation, les différentes pratiques de l'impression 3D en contexte de réhabilitation en surdicicité, et aussi de définir quelles sphères de la vie qui vont pouvoir être impactées par l'impression 3D. Et surtout, notre objectif, c'est d'en informer les professionnels de la réhabilitation et les familles sur justement les implémentations possibles d'impression 3D, puis aussi l'impact potentiel sur la qualité de vie des personnes en surdicicité. Donc, ce qu'on a fait, c'est une revue de la portée de la littérature en suivant la méthode de RC et O'Malley. On a fait une recherche compréhensive dans 10 bases de données en utilisant le plus possible de mots-clés sur l'impression 3D et sur la surdicité afin d'aller chercher tous les articles possibles qui concernent son utilisation en réhabilitation pour les personnes en surdicicité. Et donc, notre but, c'est d'inclure les articles qui vont suivre les critères suivants. Dans le fond, ce qu'on recherche, c'est les articles qui vont utiliser l'impression 3D, et les technologies les plus populaires, les plus répandues de l'impression 3D en contexte de réhabilitation pour les buts de réhabilitation des personnes en surdicicité. Ce qu'on veut vraiment, c'est que l'imprimante 3D ou l'objet imprimant 3D soit utilisé directement par la personne en surdicité ou par le professionnel de la réhabilitation. Puis ensuite, on va exclure ceux qui vont utiliser l'impression 3D afin de prototyper des appareils qui, ultimement, ne vont pas être manufacturés avec l'impression 3D, ou bien les études qui vont utiliser l'impression 3D pour un usage plus médical, de production de tissus ou de prothèses, par exemple. Donc, à la suite, de notre recherche, on a pu trouver un total de 915 articles, premièrement, qu'on a ensuite réduit à un nombre de 8 articles qui correspondaient à nos critères de recherche. À l'intérieur de ces 8 articles-là, on a trouvé 4 article vraiment qui traitait spécifiquement de l'impression 3D pour les individus en surdicité, dont 2 qui avaient impliqué des participants. Et ensuite, les 4 autres, c'était plus pour la déficience visuelle en général, mais il y en avait 2 qui avaient impliqué des participants avec une surdicité et 2 autres qui avaient impliqué des professionnels qui, en plus de travailler avec des gens en déficience visuelle, travaillaient avec des gens en surdicité. La plupart des études ont été faites dans les 4 dernières années, surtout en Europe, avec la France qui mène la recherche avec 3 publications dans ce domaine-là. Et en général, on a 4 articles surtout qui traitaient de populations plus jeunes, donc vraiment des enfants, des adolescents, des jeunes adultes, environ entre 6 et 21 ans, au niveau, bref, de leur éducation. Ce qu'on a trouvé, c'est 3 sphères de la vie principales qui vont pouvoir être affectées par l'impression 3D, surtout la communication, l'apprentissage et la mobilité. Et on a aussi trouvé 3 façons différentes d'utiliser l'impression 3D. Bref, premièrement, l'impression 3D comme outil indépendante, sinon comme moyen de complémenter du matériel qui est déjà existant, ou bien d'utiliser l'impression 3D en combinaison avec d'autres technologies, d'autres électroniques, afin de faire des appareils plus complexes et interactifs. Donc, premièrement, au niveau de la communication, l'impression 3D elle a le potentiel de pouvoir produire des appareils de communication en centre de réhabilitation même, que ce soit des cartes simples là, de communication afin de communiquer avec des personnes qui n'ont pas nécessairement connaissance du langage des signes tactiles ou d'autres langages utilisés par les personnes en surdicité, ou bien pour créer des appareils un peu plus complexes qui vont pouvoir donner accès vraiment à la communication à distance via Internet. Bref, lorsqu'ils sont combinés à des programmes de reconnaissance de l'image, de texte écrit ou de texte parlé, et qui vont transformer ce langage-là en un langage qui est compris et utilisé par une personne en surdicité. Et justement, pour ces appareils-là, qu'est-ce qui est intéressant, c'est que les projets qui sont en cours vont être open source, donc ils vont mettre à disposition les modèles 3D, les pièces à se procurer, puis aussi tout le software nécessaire afin de créer puis comment dire, recréer ces appareils-là. Ensuite, au niveau de l'apprentissage, c'est surtout afin de produire du matériel adapté, vraiment de rendre accessibles des concepts qui pourraient être seulement accessibles via la vision, par exemple, comme ici, un article avait fait un globe terrestre tactile et un autre avait fait des cartes tactiles qui rendaient possible l'apprentissage des différentes chaînes de montagnes en Europe. Sinon, c'est de créer des objets qui vont pouvoir complémenter les graphiques tactiles utilisés présentement. Bref, en fournissant des objets qui sont détaillés, qui sont intéressants, surtout pour les enfants, qui vont vraiment améliorer la motivation puis la coopération des étudiants, ou de créer des prototypes plus interactifs, que ce soit des cartes, des timelines ou bien des livres tactiles avec des objets puis des illustrations imprimées en 3D. Ensuite, au niveau de la mobilité, c'était plus secondaire à travers les articles, mais on a trouvé, dans le fond, une façon avec comme on a mentionné tantôt, les cartes de communication, ce serait une façon assez simple de communiquer avec des étrangers lorsqu'on se promène en lieu public, ou est-ce que ça devient important et même des fois nécessaire de communiquer avec des étrangers afin de demander des directions, demander confirmation de sa position, par exemple, ou bien de créer des objets qui vont complémenter les cartes tactiles, des objets, encore une fois, qui vont être plus intéressants, plus détaillés, et même pour les enfants, de leur créer des avatars, soit à leur image ou en fonction de leurs intérêts, afin de vraiment améliorer leur motivation, mais aussi leur intérêt à interagir avec la carte et à se projeter à l'intérieur des cartes. Et encore une fois, pour faire des cartes tactiles interactives. Bref, là, on a survolé quelques utilisations potentielles de l'impression 3D. Ce qui ressort là-dedans, c'est qu'il manque encore beaucoup de recherche de tests de validation des différents appareils. Justement, dans les 8 articles qu'on a trouvés, seulement 4 impliquaient des participants en surdicité et c'est seulement 2 qui ont divulgué des résultats spécifiques à cette population-là et seulement une qui en a discuté. Et pourquoi? Bien, surtout dans les recherches qui traitent de la déficience visuelle, bien, ils classent les personnes en surdicité dans le même groupe que les personnes en déficience visuelle, ce qu'on sait qu'on ne devrait pas faire à cause de tous les autres défis de communication qui s'ajoutent. Et bref, pour finir, pour qu'il y en ait des implications là, pour la pratique, pour la recherche, bien, l'impression 3D a vraiment de nombreux avantages des utilisations potentielles qu'on peut en faire. Bref, pour donner accès à des appareils qui vont permettre la communication à distance avec Internet. Ça va même être peut-être une future solution justement au manque de matériel adapté en éducation, en orientation et mobilité, surtout quand ce matériel-là est soit juste inexistant ou bien trop cher pour les clients. Et de faire ça justement dans un sens qui donne le pouvoir aux professionnels afin de créer du matériel eux-mêmes en fonction des besoins et des idées de leurs étudiants ou de leurs clients et de les impliquer dans ce processus-là de production. Par contre, comme on a dit, ça nécessite encore beaucoup de recherche, beaucoup de tests de validation chez la population afin de vraiment voir le réel avantage que pourrait avoir cette technologie-là. Mais surtout, on a vu qu'il y a vraiment un besoin au niveau de la collaboration interdisciplinaire entre les professionnels de la réhabilitation et d'autres professionnels comme des ingénieurs, des spécialistes des technologies informatiques ou bien des services d'impression 3D pour rendre accessible beaucoup plus de ressources d'impression 3D, mais aussi parce que les professionnels qui ont participé aux études sentent le besoin d'avoir plus de formation pour proprement utiliser une imprimante 3D et même faire leur propre modèle 3D. Donc, ben, merci beaucoup pour votre attention. J'aimerais remercier le Dr. Wittich, Atul et Peter qui m'ont grandement aidé dans cette recherche-là, ainsi que les organisations qui ont financé le projet. Merci pour votre attention.
Merci Maxime, comme toujours, extraordinaire. Je te laisse regarder, on a un commentaire spécifiquement pour toi dans le chat. On va retourner au chat un peu plus tard. Et comme toujours, j'encourage tout le monde à utiliser le chat pour poser des questions. We will answer all the questions at the very, very end once we are past the final presentation. Also, Natalie, I have texted you one of those questions if you want to have a read while Atul is presenting. Voilà, on arrive à la troisième partie d'aujourd'hui. Je vous donne Atul Jaiswal. Atul is a postdoc in my lab right now, who as a background comes from the world of social work and occupational therapy, did his PhD at Kingston in rehabilitation science and is now doing a CIHR-funded postdoc in the lab. And he is branching into an entirely different direction of what we're doing in the lab, meaning sensory loss and cognitive functioning. Atul, the screen is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wittich. So bonjour, everyone. I'll be talking in English today. And I think it's great that Maxim was able to touch on some of the aspects of deaf blindness today, because I'll be sort of repeating some of that, but with a different lens altogether. So I'll start my presentation. Bonjour, everyone. My name is Atul Jaiswal, and I'm a Health System Impact Postdoctoral Fellow, jointly supported by CIHR, FRQS, and NLB. I'm working in Dr. Wittich's lab, and today's talk is all about a scoping review project on cognitive functioning in older adults with concurrent hearing and vision impairment that we embarked when COVID-19 halted all our empirical search activities in March. So this project idea is a brainchild of Dr. Wittich, and this review is a teamwork of my lab mates, and which I'm presenting on behalf of my lab today. So I would also like to acknowledge the support and guidance from Dr. Wittich and his grant support from CIHR. And I also would like to acknowledge my postdocs sort of funding agencies and research partners who are here. So now let me introduce you to the landscape of concurrent hearing and vision impairment, or deaf blindness, or dual sensory impairment. So there are almost 12 different terminologies that are used to identify or label this population across the globe. but I will prefer the terminology of dual sensory impairment or DSI. That's what I will be using today in this presentation. So what is deaf blindness? Deaf blindness, Maxim already talked about it, but I will sort of go in little sort of a snapshot. So deaf blindness is a combination of hearing and vision impairment in the same individual, and it affects access to information, mobility, communication, and other areas of functioning of daily life. And it is unique in its own way because it's a varying combination of both the impairment, like hearing as well as vision, that will produce a unique condition which is more disabling than only hearing or only vision. So whenever we say this word unique, and why we say deaf blindness is a unique disability, because those with unisensory impairment, such as those with only vision or hearing impairment, could compensate using the other intact sense to perform the functioning. But for those with DSI, the compensation is not possible to in the best possible way, and that's why it is said to be more disabling and complex to work with. So I think I'll be using a quote by Helen Keller that beautifully explains why this is unique condition. So she says that blindness separates us from things, but deafness separates us from people. So now imagine how your life will be if you are separated from people around you and you're separated from things in your life. So I think I wanted to set the stage for this presentation today with this premise, so that we know that sort of how the world of deaf blindness or DSI look like, and then we can relate to the work that we have done in this scoping review that I'll be presenting today. So Maxim already talked about this, so I'll quickly snapshot go through this. So there are three different groups that we see in the DSI population. Group one, those who are like Helen Keller, who have developed deaf blindness or DSI by birth, or before the development of language, before the age of 3. And then the group 2 is like the person has developed one impairment in the initial stages of their life, around 3 to 5 years of age, and then later on they develop another impairment. So they are either born deaf and then they lose their sight later on, which is a case of Usher syndrome, in which retinitis pigmentosa leads to sight loss later on in their life. And then the group 3, which I'm going to talk about, which is important group as well, which is I think important population that we are going to study in this current scoping review, is age-related deaf blindness, which is group 3, where people have seen their fair amount of their life without any impairment of hearing and or vision or any disability so far. And then now when they hit the age of 60, then they start to develop hearing and vision issues. So their stories are very different. So all these three groups that I'm referring to right now, they have their unique stories, and that's what we'll be sort of trying to understand in the scoping that we have conducted. So interesting fact that the group 1 is very much common in low income countries, and group 3 is very let's say prevalent in high income countries such as Canada. So the current estimates, like there's a World Federation of Deafblind Global Report that came up in 2018 that estimated that around 2% of the world population has some form of DSI, which means approximately 150 million people in the world, and that means approximately 1 million people in Canada. So let's just take an example. Let's just situate all these numbers in this current context of Canada's today's population. So imagine if Canada's today's population is around 38 million, we mean that out of that 38 million, 1 million people have this current condition of DSI. And if that is the case, every 1 out of 38 person has this condition in Canada. But why don't we see them? So it's like surprise that we are saying that out of 38, every 1 person is having this, but why don't we see them very often in our society? The reason being that this condition of DSI is less understood among researchers, professionals, and general public. And that's why your eyes will only see what your brain knows. So if your brain is aware that DSI is like this, so then you can identify that, yes, this person may have DSI. And this DSI condition ranges from anyone who is having low vision to blindness for vision impairment, and mild hearing loss to total deafness for hearing impairment. So it's a spectrum condition and very heterogeneous group. So now I'll sort of take you to the older population because that's the focus of this study. So now let's see the group 1. Like people who are, so the population of older adults can be classified into 3 categories right now in Canada as well. So the first group is people who belong to group 1, who were born with deaf blindness and now have been living their life with visual and hearing impairment for most of their life. And now they are getting older. Now they're above 60. second group 2. So they have lived with one single sense impairment for some of their life, or maybe both the impairment for their life, and now they are about 60 years. So they belong to people who are from group 2, and now they are growing old. And group 3, which I talked about already, that people have had no impairment at most of their life, but then they acquired sense impairment in their old age. So the third group, the group 3, is the most largest group, because and their experiences are very unique. So, and the causes of behind group 3 is like the DSI in group 3 is presbyocusis, age-related macular degeneration, cataract, glaucoma, and diabetes retinopathy, to just name a few causes behind this condition in group 3. So the research problem that we wanted to understand, or they wanted to explore or answer, was so what has happened that there is an emerging evidence that emerging evidence on the association of between unisensory, like only vision or only hearing, and cognitive decline. So that is coming up these days. So that link is almost well understood by now, but the link between CI and DSI is less understood so far. So Dr. Wittig and his team of Canadian researchers from CCNA, they are already doing some effort in trying to understand the phenomena of DSI in older adults with CI, or those who have dementia. So our current project takes a reverse approach, and then we try to understand the phenomena of CI, cognitive impairment, in older adults with DSI. So we're not trying to understand DSI in population of people who have cognitive impairment or decline. We are trying to understand the phenomena of cognitive impairment in older adults who have DSI, especially when we know that we have around 1 million individuals in Canada who are experiencing this condition. So to prevent and manage cognitive decline in older adults with DSI, I think it's very important to understand the consequences of cognitive impairment in older adults with DSI. So through this scoping review project that we embarked, we wanted to understand what level of evidence already exists on CI in older adults with DSI. And so that this understanding will help us to plan for specific empirical studies in this field, and then continue to advance this knowledge. So our study objective was to synthesize evidence on CI in older adults, like CI cognitive impairment in older adults with DSI, and summarize what is known about prevalence, incidence, and risk factors of CI in this population. We chose scoping review because it's a systematic way of conducting literature review for this particular study. To scope our project, we wanted to be very clear with our PCC, population, concept, and context. So that's how we have defined PCC. So our population is anyone who is an older adult above 60 years and have concurrent hearing or vision impairment. For our concept was cognitive impairment. So we wanted to understand any impairment that can range from mild to severe of one or more cognitive domains, like that is affecting memory, attention, or any executive functioning of brain. That's what is seen as cognitive impairment. For context, we have not restricted ourselves to any study. So any study from any part of the world was welcomed. And there was no language and date restriction that we applied on this. So these are our inclusion criteria. So we were only interested in studies that are focusing on cognitive functioning, or they are trying to understand cognitive function. And if they have population which is ensuring that they have at least one person with DSI, and then the population is older adult. But we are not interested in studies which are done on animal model studies or genetic studies, or studies that are conducted on children or working age adults group. So these type of studies we were interested in, where we wanted to understand the original studies, just research studies like RCTs, observational, descriptive, cohort studies, case control studies, cross-sectional, qualitative studies, mixed methods. So our study was very comprehensive in its own way, because we wanted to capture each and everything that is out so far on this topic. And with respect to DSI, we wanted to ensure that if person through a self-report, if subjectively that through a self-report, the person has identified that they have DSI in the research study, or through objective measures of standardized screening assessment tools, they have been reported that they have this condition of hearing and vision impairment simultaneously. So these were the 6 scientific databases that we use in this study, and we finally ended up having 11595 articles to screen. But because we had a big team from our lab, and we had a wonderful person, Peter, in our lab, who is managing all this database search and everything. So it went very smoothly. It took us almost 3 months to screen all the articles, but now we have got to a level that out of 11701 studies that you can see in the screen, which was the initial pool of our records, we got down to 56 studies that were really relevant to answer our research question that we started with on prevalence, incidence, and risk factor. So now I'll present my preliminary findings of this review. So we are still analyzing the data. So these are the preliminary findings that I'm going to present today to all of you. And hopefully you'll see a paper soon in this year itself. So the preliminary findings of this study highlighted that the prevalence studies on CI, cognitive impairment in older adults with DSI, are limited. We found some, but not a lot. And the studies were ranging from cross-sectional studies, survey-based, and some population-based studies as well, but not a lot of, I said, not a lot of RCTs and other high-level evidence-based studies. Only one study was found reporting incidence of CI, and also I'll say that we have found only one study that was talking about the gender aspect, that like explored the difference of like the incidence or the prevalence of CI in like older women and older men. So that was, we found only one study through our research that captured that notion as well. However, we believe that through all the understanding that we have developed so far, we believe that there is strong evidence for association of cognitive impairment with DSI, because that's what we wanted to prove through this work. And out of the 56 studies that we found 20 studies reported several measures of likelihood or risk for developing CI among older adults with DSI. And so they have used odds ratio, relative risk, or hazard ratio. Just for our audience, I would like to sort of touch on all these three things before I show you the next slide deck. So odds ratio is a likelihood of an event for those who are exposed versus those who are not. So in our case, it's likelihood of having CI for those who have DSI versus those without DSI. Relative risk is how much more risk of a CI that an older adult with DSI has over those who do not have DSI. That's a relative risk. Hazard ratio is all about rate of developing a hazard, which is CI in our case, over a period of time when one has DSI relative to a group without DSI. So these are the sort of three things that we were able to capture from the studies that we have, which I have tried to show it here. So I don't have all 20 studies here, but I have tried to show you the most important 14 studies. So like you can see, the first 8 are focusing on, they have used the word cognitive impairment or decline. So that's why I've labeled them as CI based studies. And the later half, first 5 are talking about using dementia as a word. And the last one is all about intellectual disability. So that odds ratio. So all these studies are, these findings are like here, presented here. They have been sort of derived from adjusted models. So the confounding variables were adjusted, and then these odds ratio or risk ratio or hazard ratio. So RR that you can see here in the red is relative risk ratio, and then HR is hazard ratio. So here the point to note here is that we found only one study by Liu Kim in 2018, which talks about female versus male odds ratio, and but still, out of all these studies, we could not find any study that has captured group 1 and 2 older adults in their study. So the most of these studies were focused on people who have, like, who belong to group 3, older adults from the group 3, but not, so none of these studies have captured people from, in their sample, people from who have DSI and they belong to group 1 and 2, and then they are about 60. So that was one big knowledge gap.
Atul?
Yeah.
Atul, just to keep in mind, we have 10 minutes left right now for question and answers for all 3 sessions. So I'll let you time it accordingly.
Okay, sure. So the interpretations are this, that the likelihood of developing dementia is between 39% to 86% higher in this population, older adults with DSI. The likelihood of developing cognitive impairment is between 38 to 400%. Four times we can say that the likelihood is high if they already have DSI. So, and within that, there's also a dose response manner. People have sort of captured that the risk of dementia is high. And one study by Yamada, they found that 41% of those with severe DSI have severe CI, so which talks about, which explain the dose response matter, and 25% with mild DSI had mild CI. So, and in terms of prevalence and incidence, we just found one study that reported incidence of CI, which is 66.4. And then we had several other studies that reported prevalence, but because there was a variation in the sampling, things were different. And as you can see here, that like it can range from 1.27 as a prevalence rate and go up to till 70% in the last study Davidson Davidson colleagues in 2019, where they are saying 70% of those with DSI had CI. So it's a range. And then in terms of risk factors that were reported in the study, out of 56 articles, 20 articles reported risk factors. And so some of them were general, like depression, hearing impairment, and social isolation. That was reported for older adults in general, and that is also applicable to older adults with DSI. 13 of them were specifically highlighting that DSI itself is a big risk factor for cognitive decline in older people. And there were also some studies that clearly highlighted that hearing impairment versus vision impairment is a bigger sort of risk factor for developing CI in older adults, with DSI or in general. And then the other aspects of comorbidities, like having condition like diabetes, cataract, or social isolation, illiteracy, physical inactivity, and gender, which you already touched on in the previous slide, that the gender was shown that in women, hearing impairment was more prevalent as compared to men. So these are my conclusions or implications. So we have very limited evidence that exists in CI in older adults with DSI, and we need more population-based studies in Canadian context to understand this phenomenon in proper way. And so this will help us in proper identification of cognitive impairment in older adults with DSI, which is very vital for planning for effective rehabilitation intervention and support. And as we know that the numbers are increasing, the numbers of older adults with DSI are going to increase down the line with the baby boomer generation. Numbers are increasing. So we need more research, and so that we can adapt, we can come with adaptive strategies for cognitive assessment and rehabilitation techniques to meet the needs of these older adults with DSI. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Atul. Excellent. So I encourage people to pose questions in the chat. On a déjà quelques-unes qui sont posées. Et on peut commencer avec des questions pour Nathalie. Natalie, we have questions from Claudine Auger,
yes,
who writes to us. Actually, Claudine, veux-tu poser ta question directement? Est-ce que tu as accès au microphone?
Well, with the time we have, maybe I thought what I see is interesting here is two of the presentations were addressing implications for decision makers. And I thought, should we take the ball and say, you know, is there any way that career researchers and students can have some influence? But this was taking much more than 6 minutes to answer. But I just think that we should take, you know, that message that comes from your two studies to say, oh, how can we do this? How can we bring this information to a table somewhere? So it's really like a very open-ended question.
Well, yeah, for sure. One of the things I mentioned on my final slide, I don't believe I said this out loud, but I find the results from my study to be very empowering, because a lot of the factors that we found to contribute to the success of older Braille learners are things that we could enhance through policy and practice changes. So it isn't age that's primarily playing a role, it's the decisions that we make as a whole. And so I think for sure, I mean, through knowledge translation activities, which I know the CRIR engages in all the time, but also through conversations that we have with government funding agencies to really point to that evidence from these research studies to really pinpoint that, we could be better serving clients if we really consider what the realities are when we're developing these eligibility criteria, especially as the population is changing from what it was before. And I did see your other questions, so I'd be happy to connect with you offline to answer those.
Thank you.
We have a question from Karen Lee for Atul. I'm wondering where is the classification of individuals with MCI would fit? That's a really interesting question.
Yes, so I have already typed my answer, but I would say that yes, we have classified within the category of CI. Like, I think we were sticking to terminology that researchers have used in their study. So we have not, like if people have used cognitive decline, cognitive impairment, cognitive dysfunction, or anything else, we stick to our cognitive impairment sort of classification, and that's where we have categorized them. So hopefully this, by the end of within this year, you'll see the papers coming out soon, because we are in writing process as well as we are analyzing the data. So we'll have more findings, but yeah, we are happy to sort of discuss more of this offline as well. So I can share my email, or it is already, or I can share my email and then we can connect more.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to make a mini comment to Claudine's question about how do we test CI in the DSI population, parce que c'est similaire aussi à une question à l'envers pour le CCNV de comment tester la vision et l'audition dans les personnes avec une démence. This is the million-dollar question, because the moment we measure vision or hearing, we need people to be cognitively engaged. The moment we measure cognition, almost all tests require hearing. Many of them require vision because of the instructions. And so this is always together. And we're still trying to figure this out pour chercher vraiment des tâches ou des façons d'engager les personnes ou observer leur comportement qui sont indépendants de la vision, de l'audition, de la cognition. And this is not easy. So there's an entire team working on this. And when we have something useful for you, we will report back to you.
Yeah, I know Carolina Bottari does some very interesting work, and I know she's not into, sensory deficits at all. So I think maybe it would be interesting to see how researchers outside, but are still, could bring some light, but probably, as you say, there are teams that focus on that for years and years. But yeah, so I just find I would like to, she's not here, I watch, and sometimes we don't realize that we could link together because of the title of a presentation.
Alida, you have 1 minute. Do you want to do the closing mot de clôture du CRIR?
Absolutely. Thank you, Walter. I just want to finish with a thank you to all of you for joining us today, and a little reminder or promo plug for our next Getting to Know Each Other conference, which is January 26th, donc la semaine prochaine. It's with Gordon Bloom and 3 of his students, and they're going to be talking about parasport. So I've put the link to the website in the chat. There's a link on the website of where you can register to make sure you get that Zoom link. And that's all for today. Merci beaucoup encore à tout le monde. Puis je vous souhaite une bonne journée.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, everyone.